Hey, I'm Lance Irwin. I'm with Men's Ministry Network. Thank you for being here tonight, taking a Thursday night out, and also premiere of Avengers Endgame. So I'm missing that right now. But I'm glad to be here with you guys. And for the guys on Facebook, just want to welcome you. Thanks for joining us. Hope that soon you can come and join us in person. I'd also like to thank Stewart Heights for hosting us, their men's ministry, especially RL and Keith and Skip. Thank you guys for serving us. At Men's Ministry Network, it's our desire to see present every man mature in Christ. And the way we do that is to really work with local churches to help them engage men with a practical vision of what disciple making looks like, equip men to walk with God and succeed in life, and then encourage those men to be on mission in ministry. One of the ways we do that is we hold these gatherings. We hold them quarterly. Tonight's our first inaugural Facebook Live event, so hopefully we can do that more and have an opportunity for more guys to engage with us. But this is just a place for us to gather together, to network, but also to really figure out your next step in maturity. So what's the next step you need to take? So hopefully that's my prayer for you tonight, for me as well, that's what we can get come out of this tonight is what's the next step. So to that end, we're going to hear an equipping and challenging message from our guest, Vince Miller. And then we're going to break into these three groups. So I've kind of got you seated at tables already, but feel free to move around as I describe it later, what the groups are. It's really those who need to get connected, those who need to lead, and those who are already leading. All right, well, let me introduce Vince Miller. Vince is no stranger to the impact of a spiritual mentor. Vince grew up in a broken and drug-impacted home. God sent a faithful grandfather to mentor Vince, who at the age of 20 surrendered his life to Christ. And soon after, Vince lost his grandfather, but committed to mentoring men just as his grandfather had mentored him. After serving in ministries like Young Life, InterVarsity, and others for 25 years, Vince founded Resolute, which is a ministry devoted to providing men with tools for discipleship and mentorship. So Vince produces the Man's Daily Devo, which I think you've got a card there on your table, and the Man Talk podcast, which I will be subscribing to. His latest book, 30 Virtues That Build a Man, is a devotional and mentoring guide for men. So join me in welcoming Vince Miller. Can I pray for you?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Father, I just come before you thankful for the work you've done in my life and in Vince's life, and I thank you for safe travels and bringing him here with us. Look forward to what you're going to do through his willingness to serve you, God. So would you take glory, speak through Vince to all of our hearts, and Holy Spirit, we'll give the praise to Christ in his name. Amen.
Thank you. Well, good evening, guys. How are you?
Yeah.
Good. Awesome. Nice to be with you. I was in Minnesota just a few hours ago, so that's where I hail from, St. Paul, Minnesota. Married to a wife, beautiful wife, 3 children, 20, 18, and 15. So our life is busy, fun, and full. And anyway, I'm excited to be invited here, Lance. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm going to give you a little bit of just an awareness of what I do. So there's one thing that I do that tens of thousands of men actually read every day, which I'm humbled by. It's the Men's Daily Devo. And I actually put some cards on your table if you're looking for a devotional, just a short scripture, thought, prayer, actionable. And it is such a great joy to write those devotionals. Every day I write those for one man. Usually someone writes me and says, I need a devotional for this, and I actually write it for that dude. And it's been my great joy, so I'd love to hear your thoughts, or if there's a thought that you're looking for, or something you're stewing on, or a way that you want to grow, I would love to provide you with God's Word, written especially for men. I also produce a video series, or a number of them, for guys that you can find on major platforms, small group video series for men, and I do write books. So that I brought some of them with me tonight, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But my story is really where I want to begin, because I think it's a story that intersects with all of our lives. We all as guys are kind of on a particular journey, And I really believe that God is the author of that journey and guiding us along the way. But mine was probably similar, maybe a little bit different than some of yours. So I grew up in California, the San Francisco Bay Area, Vallejo, which is Northeast Bay. Lived there till I was about 20 or so. I was raised by a dad who was an atheist, a very strong, pronounced atheist, so much so that we didn't use God's name in the house as a curse word. Think about that for a second. Yeah. My mom was an agnostic, and she had started her life off with a faith, but walked away from it because she just felt hurt by the church. And because of that, I grew up in a home that really didn't know God. We didn't celebrate things like Easter or Christmas. We didn't put a Christmas tree in our house. And in fact, my mom and dad tried to convince me that God wasn't real. And the way that they tried to convince me that God wasn't real was that they said the church is full of broken people and Christians are hypocrites. And I came to discover that they were right. Actually, they're true. The church is actually full of broken people, and I'm one of those guys, and Christians are hypocrites because we're all broken people. What I came to discover later in life is that Christianity wasn't founded upon Christians in the church or hypocritical Christians in the church. It was founded upon a man named Jesus who did what he said he was going to do and lived in a way that honored God. And as soon as I put those pieces together, everything changed. And the reason why everything changed is because someone stepped into my life to mentor me. Here's what happened. My mom and dad divorced when I was about 2. Dad left, all lived in the same town still, in Vallejo, California. My mom remarried again a few years later, divorced again, sloppy marriage, didn't work out. After that, I was probably about 12 or 13 or so, and my mom came to me one day and said, I'm not going to remarry anymore because I can see that it's having an effect on you. For some reason, she thought it was better to have a bunch of boyfriends in and out of the house, and that didn't really help. And eventually, at some point, my grandfather steps into the story. So my grandfather was probably about 68 at the time, retired, old Navy guy, pretty cool, pretty athletic, pretty healthy, played golf every day of his life except for Thursdays, which was Women's Day. And there were all kinds of reasons to not golf on Thursday. I heard every one of them. All right? Now, my grandfather was a Christian, and he came over to my house when I was probably about 15 or so, and I want you to know it was the first time I ever saw a Christian man in our home, ever. 15, this guy walks in. I knew him, but he was never allowed to come in our home. He sits down at the kitchen table with my mom, and because I'm so curious as to why she's allowed him into the house, I'm listening around the corner, and he's begging my mom to allow her to free me up so I could spend time with him. That was just an interesting moment. I heard my mom abdicate raising me, and essentially from that moment on, I started spending time with grandfather. In fact, eventually I moved into his home. Now, Grandpa was a pretty simple dude. Like I said, I only knew him in my life as a retired man, as someone who golfed, who was just cool, athletic, fun to be with. But this was the guy whose life was very, very different from my life. Very different. Because all of a sudden I walked into a home where there was a family experience. My grandmother and him would set me down for dinner. We would eat together at a table, and we would look each other in the eyes. We'd actually have a conversation with one another. My grandfather would start the conversation and the meal with a prayer, and I was forced to keep my eyes shut during this time. Every once in a while peeking, of course, right? Of course. And then grandfather would pray, and then we'd sit there, and then grandma would go into the kitchen, and she'd bring the meal out, and it was always a protein, a starch, and a vegetable. Every single time. It wasn't Totino's pizza rolls, which I was raised on. It wasn't Swanson dinners, which I was raised on by myself at a table. It was an actual meal, and you had to eat all of it. And you didn't get up from the table until my grandfather gave you permission to leave the table. It was just such a remarkable difference in the way that they lived versus the way that my mom and my dad lived. But I got to tell you, this guy, my grandfather, was such a simple guy. He just did simple things with me. He invested time with me, he passed on things, and he taught me how to do things that every guy wants to understand how to do as a young man. He taught me how to have manners at a table. I never learned that before. He taught me how to have conversations with others. He taught me how to stick out my hand and to look someone in the eyes and greet them and learn their name and say hello and to hold my chin up high. He taught me how to open doors for women. He taught me how to pick up girls, right? He taught me all these things, how to shave, how to walk, how to live life, how to deal with issues. And then one day he taught me how to drive. He actually taught me how to drive when I was 16 on this vehicle right here. So what you're about to see is the actual truck that my grandfather owned in 1986. My grandfather bought this truck off the showroom floor in 1958. At that time, it was this Chevy tan color, right? And then he owned it all those years. In the 70s, he had it restored one time. And because for some reason gold metal flake was cool in the 70s, he had it painted gold metal flake, right, with big white walls on it. It was just super cool for some reason. And then when I turned 15, now living in his house, he had it restored to this condition right here. Now, what was really special about this moment was I remember when he brought it home for the very first time in this condition, nut and bolt restoration, beautiful job. I mean, it was just exquisite. I mean, it was so exquisite that this truck became kind of a show quality truck in our family, and we used to take it to car shows together and show it. Won trophies with it. It was just amazing. But my grandfather came to me after he pulled this truck in home and said, Vince, if you can learn to drive Liz, this is Liz, if you can learn to drive Liz, I will give her to you when you turn 16. That was a pretty interesting proposition for me in 1986, right? I'll never forget that moment. I was like, you'll do what? You'll give me that truck? He says, yes. Now, what's spectacular about this truck was there was never anything wrong with this truck. My grandfather drove it all those years and never once dinged this truck. In fact, I remember going to the shop and watching them as they had taken the body off of the chassis and stripped it down to sheer metal when the guys are standing around the truck mesmerized that they can't find 1 ounce of Bondo anywhere on this truck. Not one. My grandfather drove it all those years without ever scratching it or dinging it ever in his life. Seriously, ever. And he drove it every single day. Well, we bring this thing home and it's fire engine red and it's got 7 clear coats on this truck. I mean, it's just shining beautiful. And I got to tell you, as soon as that thing pulled into the driveway, with my grandfather making a proposition like he did, I guarantee you I paid attention to everything that he did when he got in that truck from that point on. I watched how he drove it, how he treated it, how he started it, how he stopped it, how he moved it onto the road, how he parked it, everything. And I learned remarkable lessons from my grandfather on this. I'll never forget it. Because I want you to know there's nothing automatic about this truck whatsoever. There isn't one automatic feature on this truck. It had one of those big bus-like steering wheels that on a hot California day, those tires would stick to the concrete and you almost had to yank with 2 hands on the side of this bus-like steering wheel to get it to turn at a stop. It had a 3-on-a-tree transmission, right? Non-synchro, which meant you had to come to a stop before you put it into gear. You couldn't just California stop this truck. You actually had to stop it and then put it into gear. It had a starter on the floor. I remember I had to get up out of the seat that didn't adjust without seat belts to start this thing with that starter on the floor. Wing windows, we call that an air conditioner in California, right? It just had all these really cool and interesting features, but there was nothing automatic about it. And I'll never forget the moment that I finally got my pink slip. I'll never forget it. It was the day that I knew that I had a pass to finally take this truck out on a road. I went and took my test, came home, had my pink slip, turned to my grandfather and said, can we take Liz out for a drive? He said, sure. So we hop in the truck, get it started, head on down the road about 3 blocks, come to a stop on a hill. Because in California, you're either going up or down or 90. That's basically what you're doing in California. And no kidding, I come to the stop on a hill, and this woman pulls up right behind me. As close as she could possibly get. Right? She's so close I actually can't see her face. But I'm a little guy in the truck. I can barely see out of these mirrors, and I'm trying to navigate this moment. But as my heart's racing, I'm trying to figure out, how do I not ding this thing right now? My grandfather has never dinged this truck. He's just pulled it out of the shop I am now driving and responsible for this. I may never see this truck ever again after this moment, right? So no kidding, I get into position and I just do everything that my grandfather has taught me to do for about 6 months as I've watched him. I put one foot down on the brake, the other down on the clutch, and I kind of get into position. I drop it into first gear, move my hand from the shifter to the steering wheel, take the other hand, my left hand, reach down up on the pull up on the emergency brake, move my foot from the brake to the gas. All right, I'm like in this really weird, awkward position, trying to get this truck to go forward, and I'm using every available appendage in my body to get this thing to work. Not only that, it's got this huge spring-loaded clutch on this truck, and it's not just like this short little, it doesn't have this short little gap in this clutch where you're just going to easily cushion yourself into first gear. It's spring-loaded, it's long, you got to be able to squat like 225. Get this thing to kind of find the spot. And it jumps into gear kind of. It doesn't just smoothly release into gear. It's a farm truck. It pops into gear. And so I'm kind of looking for the spot. I'm really working the gas. And my grandfather can see that I'm kind of nervous. And then he does this thing. I can see him out of the corner of my eye. He does this thing where he looks in the side view mirror, fixes his glasses, and can see that this woman is way too close. So he looks back as he's kind of studying the situation, crosses his arms, and then turns to me and says, "Son, you better not scratch my truck." Seriously, that's what he said to me. And I just remember being so nervous in this moment that I began to sweat. My palms were sweating. I'm pitting out my shirt now. And so I did what any young man would do in this moment. I take the RPMs up to about 4,000, 5,000 RPM. Because there's no way that this truck is going to roll backwards. It may hurt my neck. We may injure ourselves, but it's not going to roll backwards, right? So I got this gas worked up way too high, and I'm about to pop the clutch, and then he just is like, "Stop, stop. Sorry, I made you nervous. Stop." He says, "Take your foot off the gas. Put your foot back down off the clutch," and et cetera, et cetera. And he said, "Put it in neutral. Rest for a second." And so I kind of take a breather for just a few seconds, and he says, "Can I give you some advice?" And I'm going, "Sure." He said, "Let me tell you what I used to do when I was a kid." And as soon as he said, "I was a kid," I was like, "Man, when was this?" Because I was like, "Man, you're like in your 70s, bro. What kind of car did you used to drive when you were a kid?" And so I started to think backwards about what he was driving, and he said, "Here's what we used to do when I was a kid." He said, "In situations like this, we would just let the truck gently roll backwards and rest it onto the bumper of the car behind you, and then take off." And then he pauses and says, "But please remember this. You better not scratch my truck." And I just remember going, "Okay, you're insane right now. Like, this is crazy." And I forgot everything that he said. I just ignored him at that point. And I went back down to work in the clutch. And as soon as I got back down to work in the clutch, this woman, I think, grew impatient and started to back up. And as soon as she did, I hopped and kind of jumped out of first gear and made my way around the corner. And I got to tell you, that was such a significant moment for me. I mean, sometimes we take moments like that for granted, but like, I will never forget that moment as long as I live. What it felt like to have a man by your side, encouraging you through the challenges of life, to feel his presence and even some of his fear, to feel his encouragement and his willingness, to hear his heart and his training at my side in that moment, in that truck, meant more to me than anything else in life. And I'll never forget it as long as I live. I also will never forget the next 6 months of my life. Because for the next 6 months, my grandfather taught me how to do one thing on this truck, and that was parallel park in Liz. She doesn't have a button on it that you push that parks itself. It was hard, fellas. Every Saturday, 3 hours for 6 months. When every other kid was out on a Saturday morning having fun, I was driving around the San Francisco Bay Area in this truck, and my grandfather just did this. Park here, park here, park here, park here, park here. That's all we did for 6 months. And I do want to say it was hell. That's what it was. It was hell on a Saturday morning. It was awful, but my grandfather knew that he had me trapped because he had made a proposition with me. He was going to give me Liz when I turned 16, but I was going to be subject to hell till we got there. And I didn't really realize it, but those 6 months were some of the most impressionable months that I've ever had in my entire life with another man. Seriously, 6 months. Because I want you to know that my grandfather, while I did take him up on his proposition and he was good on his word, and I did get this truck when I turned 16, I spent 6 months with him in this truck learning how to do one thing. And I thought it was only one thing, but it was many things. It was learning how to parallel park perfectly an inch from the curb in any vehicle known from man the very first time. You know, my grandfather died about a year later, and my wife never knew him. But the funny thing is, anytime we go out to eat downtown Minneapolis, St. Paul, on a Friday night, we take the truck out for a drive, we'll look for a spot on the street. My wife will say to me, "You can't get this truck into that spot there." To which I reply, "Woman." I don't really say that. Woman, challenge accepted. And she will attest to the fact over the 23 years that we've been married, I've never not perfectly parallel parked the very first time an inch from the curb in any vehicle. Seriously. And you know what that is? That's just master mentoring, is all it is. It's master mentoring. It's someone, one person, taking a little bit of time and a little bit of skill and investing it into somebody else. That's it. It's nothing more. It's someone taking a little bit of time and a little bit of skill and sharing it and investing it in somebody else. Nothing more. Don't overthink it. And I got to tell you, it wasn't just driving that my grandfather taught me. While I thought in my young mind it was about getting a truck, for him it was about him trapping me in these 3-hour conversations every Saturday where most of the time we were parked on the side of the road. Most of the time we weren't driving. Most of the time we were parked on the side of the road where he was talking with me about life and about conflict and about issues, about his sin, about mine, about my mom and the issues that I faced with her, about my dad and the issues that I faced with him, about God, about future, about life, and everything else that a man would ever want to talk about. We had all those conversations. Genius idea, was it not? To trap me in this place for 6 months, and I will tell you, they were some of the greatest conversations that I've ever had. And I didn't even realize it in the moment that I was having them, how precious and important every Saturday was. A little bit of skill and a little bit of time. Well, guess what? I became a Christian when I was 20 because of the conversations that my grandfather had with me in this truck. It took me a little while, but I came to discover as my grandfather unwound all the bad learning that I had picked up over years and really rewired my understanding of Christianity, God, and Jesus Christ. Because of the conversations in this truck, I made a decision for Christ. And it was actually remarkable. The sad part of the story was I made a decision for Christ at the age of 20. At the age of 21, he dies. Now, it's really tragic for me if you think about it, because I got to spend about a year with my grandfather in my new relationship, and I knew that it was just as important to him as it was to me. Just as important to him as it was for me. But I came to discover that he had hidden something from me. He had gotten cancer. Cancer all over his body. He didn't tell it to me until he got it in his spine. And as soon as he got it in his spine, it started to affect his nervous system and his muscular development and his skin color and just everything about him. And grandmother called me one day. I was off at college in Oklahoma. Called me one day and said, "You need to come home because grandfather's dying, daddy's dying." So I came home. I went straight to the hospital. And I got to spend 1 hour with my grandfather, 1 hour. In fact, I walked past the hospital room that he was in, and because he was so affected by cancer, I almost didn't recognize him when I looked into the room, except for his smile. I saw him sit up in bed painfully. He smiled at me, and I knew it was him. At this moment, skin is hanging on his bone. His muscular development is completely gone. His eyes are sunken into his head. His skin is yellowed, all the hair is gone from his body, and I saw a man smiling but in a deteriorated state. And for 1 hour we had a conversation I'll never forget it. We talked about life, and about future, about family, about school, about his truck. Still his truck for some reason. But I was going to argue with him, you know. It's not an argument to have at that moment, but his truck. And then I watched him lay there and painfully die for 5 hours. And it was awful. It was awful. It was just me listening to him gasp for air, and the gasp between the breaths grew longer and longer and longer and longer. You know, and as I sat in this room, I reflected on his life and impact on me. And in that moment, I discovered that he and his influence altered the course of my life forever. The sad part about the story was I was losing someone who I want to say was probably the most important figure in my life ever. And the reason that he was the most important figure in my life ever was because of the time that he invested with me sitting in this truck. Now, I remember reflecting on this whole thing and then saying a prayer out loud. And the prayer went something like this: God, for the rest of my life, I want to do for other men what my grandfather did for me. But God, would you please replace my grandfather to me in my life? I'll never forget that prayer. And I made good on my end of the prayer. I began and launched out into ministry and have done it the last 27 years or so, and it's been absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. And God has been truly, truly a blessing to me. And I've had this great opportunity to speak to guys just like you all over the world. And it's amazing. It's a blessing. At the same time, I really wanted God to replace him in my life. Because I want you to hear this. I had been through one dad, been through two dads, and I was about to be through my third dad. And it was devastating to me. It was absolutely devastating to me. And so that's why I asked God to replace him in my life. The funny part of the story is, and it's not so funny, was I immediately changed my major from business to Bible and started pursuing Bible like crazy and immediately jumped into ministry. But I also started to look for a guy to mentor me, to invest in my life. And I started very intentionally seeking guys out. Do you know that over 20 years, I asked guys to mentor me somewhere between 2 to 5 times a year. 2 to 5 times a year. And over 20 years, no one took me up on my offer. I thought it was just maybe remarkable coincidence. Or maybe God was just trying to irritate me. But I really wanted someone to step into this role. I looked for someone to mentor me, to disciple, to develop me, but no one ever took me up on my offer. And while it was very irritating at times, I came to discover something very unique about men. And it was a very important learning that God had taught me that I'll never forget. And it's the greatest problem that men have. It's the greatest sin of our life. In fact, I believe the sin of all sins. And I think I've discovered it, and I share with men this message everywhere I go. And so hear this message today. Here's the story of man. It begins way back at the very beginning. Because man's story is a story of God seeding us on this earth and giving us very special roles and responsibilities. Here's how it goes. God creates all things, heaven, earth, the expanse, and everything in it. And after he creates all these things and looks out at it as being good, he decides to create man, gender male. That's you guys sitting here. Creates you, drops you into the middle of his creation and says, have dominion, have authority, use your creative power, whatever you have, and really almost possess and use the domain that I've created for you. He looks at it as that way. And I wonder if God isn't mildly entertained by what we might do. Right? Like he's up there just kind of going, I wonder what my creation is going to do with my creation. And then you know what he does next? He creates an opportunity for us to do things. He tells us next, define things by speaking utterances across your lungs and vocal cords and define my creation. I again wonder if God isn't mildly entertained by this. Like he's up in heaven kind of going, I wonder what he's going to call this animal and this animal and this animal and this creature. And then next, God does something very interesting again. He gives man one moral rule. Not 2, not 10, maybe because he's new and he thinks he's slow, but he gives him one moral rule. Don't eat of the tree in the middle of the garden. There were 2 trees there. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Everything else you can do. I've even told you to create, have dominion, have power, define things with your voice, but don't eat of the tree. And then next, God does the most unusual thing by creating the most interesting thing I ever think he creates. And it's not woman. It's desire within man's heart. You see, I don't think my God ever forgets anything. He never forgets a thing. He actually sometimes might wait to deliver something in hopes of birthing something new. And inside of man, he creates this longing, desire, call it whatever you want, passion or vision. And it boils over in him for relationship. And then out of that, man goes to God because he knows that he needs something, and he gets his desires fulfilled the right way, in an orderly fashion by the God who wants to fulfill them, and then he gives him woman. What's so fascinating about the story of man is that everything falls apart in chapter 3, right? 1, 2, 3 chapters in, the whole story falls apart. What happens there is, woman is in the middle of the garden, right? And she's having a conversation with a serpent. Imagine that. She's talking to somebody, and she's having a conversation, and she's engaging in this conversation. Probably not the first time that she's had a conversation with this serpent. And as she's talking, she gets drawn into this. She's convinced that she needs to take of the fruit. She takes of the fruit, she plucks of it, she brings it back to man, and they eat. Now, while this story you think is so depictive of women and their fallen nature, please do not miss man's fallen nature. It's probably more tragic than woman's. Because as you read that story, you'll come to discover that man in this moment of injustice and sin does nothing and says nothing. There's not a word and there's not an action. And what's so funny about it is God has created him to have dominion, power, and authority. He's given him voice to speak utterances that define things, and given him a moral rule before a woman is ever created, but he's silent and does nothing. And in that moment, apathy is birthed, which is exactly the way Satan has always wanted to come between man and God, is by not you doing something, by convincing men to do nothing and to say nothing, not only in the face of injustice and sin, but in the face of opportunity that God has designed for us. And I think that we're subtly seeing Satan's plan unfolded in this world today, because Satan would love to see Christian men's voices like yours silenced. It is his greatest plan, is to keep you silent and to keep you away from other men, in hopes of quietly bringing about a silence of Christianity. And the only way for it to happen is for men like us to step into a challenge of life and fight apathy by having conversations with men. That's it. You know, this battle of apathy is something that you're always going to fight for the rest of your life. As a Christian man, you're going to have to fight against this silent voice inside that all the time says, do nothing and say nothing. But it's not until you start to fight that battle within that God starts to move and do things. And I believe that's what my grandfather did on that day that he walked into my mom's house. What he was doing was fighting against the voice that says, my daughter doesn't want me in her house and doesn't want me to spend time with my grandson. And yet that moment that he walked into my mom's house was perhaps the most formidable moment of my entire life. It changed the course of my life because my grandfather chose to not be apathetic. And I got to tell you, that's the battle you guys fight every day, is the choice to not be silent. Did you hear that? The choice to not be silent. The choice to not do nothing. And as soon as you start doing that, is at the moment that you become greater, better, more godly men. Not based upon your work, but based upon what Christ has already done for you, because he is the man who actually fought apathy at its best. He was a man of action. So my challenge for you guys today is to step into this journey by doing this one thing. And here's how we fight apathy. It's by either being mentored or mentor somebody else. That's it. That's been Jesus' plan since the beginning. In fact, God has always been looking for a man. He's been searching for him since the beginning of time, since the fall. And God, who finally, I believe, got irritated, self-provided a man in the name of a guy named Jesus Christ. And guess what this guy came doing? He came doing everything that you can't do, except for one thing he did do that you can do. He mentored 12 guys. That was it. That was his plan. And yes, Jesus did remarkable things that you can't do. Turn water into wine. Totally cool. I wish I could do it. I can't. If I did, I would have all kinds of really fun friends, right? But I can't do it. Healed a blind man, healed a bleeding woman by her simply touching the edge of his cloak, raised from the dead for the sin of all mankind, and proved it by defeating death. I mean, those are pretty remarkable miracles, but there's one thing that he does do. He does do in his humanness, that was actually, I believe, part of his systematic way to provide hope to the world. And you know what it was? He discipled 12 men. And guess what? You're sitting in this room tonight because of what he did with those 12 guys. If he doesn't disciple those 12 guys, you don't sit in this room. Regardless of how cool it was, all the things he did. Seriously. You don't sit in this room if he doesn't disciple 12 guys. Isn't that crazy? That is the coolest pyramid marketing scheme of all time. Seriously. And he invites you into this great journey. And he doesn't say disciple the world, just a few guys. Just a few guys. And so I believe that we can fight apathy by doing this one thing. Just simply either being mentored or mentoring somebody else. Being mentored or mentoring someone else, which is why this ministry exists, right? Men's Ministry Network exists so that men will have that opportunity to be discipled, and so we can create a movement together of discipling others. All right? As you leave tonight, and as I kind of hand the mic back over, I really want to encourage you guys to either one of these journeys. Because you're probably sitting here right now going, man, I wish someone would mentor me. Well, guess what? There's people in this room that do that. And maybe there's someone here that you're thinking about that maybe God has laid on your mind that you need to be mentoring that isn't in this room. Well, I'm praying that God will just lay that name on your mind, and it will not go away until you respond to it. Because I got to tell you, if it wasn't for this man right here mentoring me, I don't know about Jesus Christ. And he didn't wait for me to invite myself into his life. He invited himself into my life. And he did it in a very loving, generous, and kind way. And so guys, God is looking to us as men to lead the way. And Satan is fearful when we fight this apathy. But do me a favor. Don't do nothing. You do nothing, and you contribute to our greatest sin of all time. I brought a couple of resources for you guys tonight. These are books that I have used to help guys to kind of engage in mentoring. One is called 20 Lessons That Build a Leader, so 20 short lessons with conversational guide in here. And this is the original resource. It's called 30 Virtues That Build a Man. 30 just basic virtues in 2-page chapters with questions. And they're actually the conversations that my grandfather had with me in this truck right here. 30 great conversations on what it looks like to be a man. Thank you for letting me be with you, Lance. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you, Vince. That was great. Guys, just want to make sure you guys know that Vince has those resources here. He'll be over here tonight. We also have Chris Ackerson with Every Man and Warriors here. So we always try to have some resources for you guys whenever we get together. So make sure you stop by and talk to those guys. I did want to be remiss if I didn't mention, guys, that you can always support us at Men's Ministry Network at mensministry.org. Just click give. That helps us to have these events free of cost, so we can get other guys to show up. Make it easy for them. Facebook friends, thanks for joining us. We're going to cut off here, and then we'll be gathering up in tables together. But hope we can see you guys soon.